Hello dear viewers, support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it, and also make sure you comment your thoughts. Now let's start the video. The Dothraki Sea stretched before Jon Snow like an endless ocean of green, its waves formed by windswept grass that rippled and danced under the morning sun. He sat astride his black Dastroya at the crest of a low hill, 4,000 men arrayed behind him in disciplined columns that would have made his father proud. The sight was magnificent and terrible, an army of liberation marching into the heart of the Horse Lord's domain. Balerion perched on a rocky outcropping nearby, his massive form no longer able to rest on Jon's shoulders as he once had. The dragon had grown to the size of a small building, his black scales gleaming like polished obsidian in the sunlight. His great head turned toward the grasslands ahead, nostrils flaring as he caught scents carried on the wind. When Balerion spread his wings to stretch them, the shadow he cast was large enough to cover a dozen men. "The scouts report movement 3 leagues ahead," Marcus Blackwood said, riding up beside Jon. The weathered knight's face was grim but determined. "Khal Temu's Khalasar, just as our intelligence suggested. They're moving their herds toward the summer grazing grounds." Jon nodded, his gray eyes studying the terrain ahead. The eastern Khalasar was the smallest of the 3 they planned to conquer, numbering perhaps 1,500 warriors plus their families and slaves. It was a good place to start, large enough to provide a meaningful addition to his forces, but not so large as to pose an insurmountable challenge. "How far behind is Jorah's column?" Jon asked. "Half a day's march to the west," Marcus replied. "He should be in position to strike Khalbarbo's Khalasar at dawn tomorrow, just as we planned." The coordination required for this campaign was staggering. 2 separate forces moving across hundreds of miles of grassland, timing their attacks to prevent the Khalasars from uniting against them. It was the kind of complex operation that could easily fall apart if even one element went wrong. But Jon had learned to trust in his commander's abilities. Behind them, the army was a study in controlled chaos. Former slaves marched alongside seasoned sellswords, their discipline honed through months of training under Jon's banner. Supply wagons creaked along the rough paths, loaded with food, weapons, and the siege equipment they might need. Outriders ranged ahead and to the flanks, their eyes constantly scanning for signs of enemy movement. "My lord," came another voice. Jon turned to see Daario Naharis approaching, his golden tooth glinting as he grinned. The flamboyant sellsword had adapted well to the grasslands, his usual silk finery replaced with practical leather and mail. The men are eager for battle. They've heard the stories about Dothraki prowess, and they want to prove themselves. "Good," Jon replied, "but make sure they remember what we're fighting for. This isn't about proving anything. It's about adding to our strength for the battles ahead." The Golden Company loomed large in all their thoughts. 20,000 professional soldiers, the finest mercenary force in the known world, gathering to crush Jon's growing rebellion. Every day that passed brought them closer to that confrontation, and Jon knew that his current force of 9,000 would not be enough. The Dothraki represented his best chance to even the odds. "Tell me about Khal Temo," Jon said to Marcus as they began their descent toward the grasslands. "What kind of man are we facing?" Marcus consulted a leather-bound journal where he kept intelligence reports. Young for a Khal, perhaps 25 years old. He inherited his position when his father died in a hunting accident 2 years ago. The older warriors still question his leadership, which could work in our favor. Strengths. He's said to be skilled with the Iraq and fearless in battle. His Khalasar is known for their speed and mobility. They can strike and disappear like ghosts on the grass. But they've never faced disciplined infantry or siege weapons. Jon nodded thoughtfully. The Dothraki were formidable opponents, but they had weaknesses that could be exploited. Their entire way of war was built around mobility and shock tactics, charging down enemies who broke and ran before their approach. Against disciplined troops who held their ground, they would be at a disadvantage. As the day wore on, Jon's army made steady progress across the grasslands. The terrain was deceptively challenging. What looked like flat ground from a distance was actually a series of rolling hills and hidden valleys. Streams meandered through the grass, their banks soft enough to bog down wagons if the drivers weren't careful. It was country that favored the horse lords, but Jon's scouts had mapped the route carefully. By midday, they could see smoke rising in the distance, the cooking fires of the Dothraki camp. Jon called a halt and gathered his commanders for a final briefing. They huddled around a map spread on the ground, weighing their options as Balerion watched from nearby. "The Khalasar is camped in that valley," Jon said, pointing to the depression ahead of them. "Natural water source, good grazing for their horses. It's a strong defensive position, but it also limits their mobility." "We could surround them," suggested one of his captains, a former sellsword named Sir Gareth. "Cut off their escape routes and force them to surrender." "The Dothraki don't surrender," Marcus said grimly. "They'll fight to the death rather than submit to what they see as weakness." "Then we give them a chance to submit with honor," Jon decided. "I'll ride forward under a peace banner and challenge their Khal to single combat. If I win, his warriors will have the choice to thaw me or face the consequences." The suggestion caused an immediate uproar among his commanders. The idea of their leader risking himself in single combat against a Dothraki Khal was almost unthinkable. "My lord, you can't," Daario protested. "These horse lords have been training with blade and bow since they could walk. It's too dangerous." "Everything we do is dangerous," Jon replied calmly. "But this is the way to minimize casualties on both sides. The Dothraki respect strength above all else. If I defeat their Khal in fair combat, they'll see it as a sign from their gods." "And if you lose?" Marcus asked bluntly. Jon's hand moved to the pommel of Longclaw, the Valyrian steel blade that had never failed him. "Then you'll have to find another way to win this battle, but I won't lose." The confidence in his voice was absolute, born from years of training and countless battles. Jon Snow had learned to fight from some of the finest swordsmen in Westeros, and his skills had been honed in the crucible of real combat. More importantly, he had something the Dothraki Khal lacked, a cause worth dying for. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Jon's army took up positions around the Dothraki camp. They moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine, each unit knowing its role and executing it flawlessly. Archers found elevated positions with clear fields of fire, while infantry formed defensive squares that could withstand cavalry charges. The siege weapons were positioned to command the valley's exits. Balerion remained with Jon as he rode toward the enemy camp under a banner of parley. The dragon's presence alone was enough to cause chaos among the Dothraki horses, which reared and whinnied in terror at the scent of the ancient predator. Jon could see warriors pointing and shouting, their usual confidence shaken by this creature from their oldest legends. The Dothraki camp was a sprawling collection of hide tents and horse corrals, organized around a central area where the Khal's pavilion stood. Smoke rose from dozens of cooking fires, and the air was thick with the scent of roasted meat and horse sweat. Children ran between the tents while women tended to daily tasks, but all activity stopped as Jon approached. Khal emerged from his pavilion as Jon dismounted. The young Dothraki leader was everything the reports had suggested, tall and lean with the bronze skin and dark hair of his people. His arak hung at his side, its curved blade gleaming with oil and care. But Jon could see uncertainty in his dark eyes as he stared at the dragon perched nearby. "I am Jon Snow," Jon announced in the Dothraki tongue, his pronunciation careful but clear. He had spent weeks learning the basics of their language for this moment. "Some call me the Wolf of Fire. I come to speak with Khal Tenmo." The young Khal stepped forward, his hand resting on his weapon's hilt. Around them, Dothraki warriors had gathered in a loose circle, their own weapons ready but not yet drawn. The tension was thick enough to cut with a blade. "You bring the winged death to our lands," Tenmo said, his voice carrying clearly across the camp. "The old women say dragons are omens of change. What change do you bring, Wolf of Fire?" "I bring an offer," Jon replied. "Join me willingly, and your people will have a place of honor in my army. We fight not for conquest, but for freedom, to break the chains that bind the innocent and build something better than what came before." Tenmo's laugh was harsh and mocking. "Pretty words from a soft Westerner. The Dothraki follow only the strong. What strength do you show beyond your winged beast?" Jon had expected this response. Among the horse lords, strength was measured in personal combat ability above all else. No amount of tactical brilliance or strategic vision would matter if he couldn't prove himself with blade in hand. "I challenge you to single combat," Jon said formally. "Winner takes all, your Khalasar follows the victor, and the defeated goes to join his ancestors." The crowd of Dothraki warriors erupted in excited shouts and wagers. This was the kind of spectacle they understood and appreciated. Temo's eyes lit up with anticipation. Here was a chance to prove his worth to his own people while eliminating a dangerous enemy. "I accept," Temo declared, drawing his arak with a flourish. "When you die, your dragon will serve me, and your army will scatter like leaves before the wind." Jon drew Longclaw in response, the Valyrian steel singing as it cleared its scabbard. The blade seemed to drink in the afternoon light, its edge sharp enough to split a hair. Around them, the Dothraki formed a fighting circle, their voices rising in ancient chants that had accompanied such duels for thousands of years. The two warriors circled each other warily, each taking the measure of his opponent. Temo moved with the fluid grace of a born horseman, his arak weaving hypnotic patterns in the air. Jon's stance was more grounded, his sword held in a classic Westerosi guard position that spoke of formal training and discipline. Temu struck first, his curved blade whistling through the air in a diagonal cut aimed at Jon's neck. Jon parried smoothly, the clash of steel on steel ringing across the camp. The Dothraki Khal was fast, his weapon moving in flowing combinations that seemed to come from every direction at once. But Jon had faced faster opponents. His training with Sir Roderick Castle, and later with some of the finest swordsmen in Essos, had prepared him for this moment. He gave ground slowly, letting Teme's initial fury spend itself against his defense while he studied his opponent's patterns. The arca was a fearsome weapon in skilled hands, but it had limitations. Its curved design made it excellent for slashing attacks, but poor for thrusting. More importantly, it was designed for fighting unarmored opponents, the kind of quick, decisive duels that settled disputes among the horse lords. Jon's mail in leather offered protection that Temo's attacks couldn't easily penetrate. When the Khala's blade scraped across his shoulder, it left only a shallow cut instead of the crippling wound it might have inflicted on an unprotected target. As the duel progressed, Jon began to press his advantage. Longclaw's superior reach allowed him to keep Temo at a distance, while the Valyrian steel's sharpness meant that even glancing blows could be devastating. He fought with the patience of a hunter, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came when Temo overextended himself in a particularly aggressive combination. The young Qohor's arak swept wide, leaving his torso exposed for a crucial heartbeat. Jon stepped forward and thrust, long Qohor's point finding the gap between Temo's vest and belt. The Valyrian steel slid between the Khal's ribs like a whisper, finding his heart with surgical precision. Temo's eyes widened in shock and pain, his arak falling from nerveless fingers. He looked down at the blade protruding from his chest, then back up at Jon's face. "Impossible," he whispered in the common tongue. "Nothing is impossible," Jon replied gently, supporting the dying man as his strength failed. "Only inevitable." Khal Temo died as the sun touched the western horizon, his blood soaking into the grass of his ancestors. The Dothraki warriors who had watched the duel stood in stunned silence, their worldview shaken by what they had witnessed. Their young Khal, the man they had followed across the grasslands, had been defeated by an outsider. Jon cleaned Longclaw on the dead man's vest before sheathing it, his movements deliberate and respectful. He had taken no joy in the killing. Temo had been brave and skilled, dying as a warrior should. But the young Khal's death served a greater purpose, one that would save countless lives in the battles to come. "Your Khal fought with honor," Jon announced to the assembled Dothraki, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "He died as a warrior facing his enemy with courage. Now you must choose. Follow me and find glory in battles yet to come, or face the consequences of defying the god's will." The response was not immediate. The Dothraki conferred among themselves in heated whispers, their voices rising and falling like the wind through grass. Jon waited patiently, knowing that this moment would determine whether his gamble had succeeded or failed catastrophically. Finally, an older warrior stepped forward. His hair was gray and his face scarred from decades of battle, but his bearing spoke of authority and respect among his people. "I am Jago, blood rider to the fallen Khal," he announced. "The gods have spoken through your blade, wolf of fire. We will follow, but know this, we follow strength, not weakness. Show us weakness, and we will remember our own ways." Jon nodded solemnly. "I would expect nothing less, but I promise you this. Follow me faithfully, and you will see battles that will be sung of for 1,000 years. Your names will live forever in the songs of your people." The integration of the conquered Dothraki into Jon's army was a complex process that took several days to complete. The Horse Lords had their own customs and traditions that couldn't simply be discarded, and Jon was wise enough to work within their cultural framework rather than against it. He appointed Drogo as the leader of the Dothraki contingent, recognizing the older warrior's authority among his people. The former Blood Rider proved to be a valuable ally, helping to smooth the transition and explain Jon's methods to warriors who had never fought as part of a larger army. The Dothraki brought more than just fighting men to Jon's cause. Their knowledge of the grasslands was invaluable, and their horses were among the finest in the known world. More importantly, they brought a different perspective on warfare, one that emphasized mobility and adaptability over rigid formations. Word of Jon's victory spread quickly across the Dothraki Sea. By the third day after the duel, riders were arriving with news from the other Khalasars. Jaqra's attack on Khal Barbo had been equally successful, though it had required a pitched battle rather than single combat. The western Khalasar had been defeated and absorbed into Jon's growing army. The third Khalasar, led by Khal Drogo's cousin Khal Moro, proved more challenging. News of the defeats had reached them, and they had begun gathering allies from smaller bands of riders. By the time Jon's combined forces reached their position, they faced nearly 3,000 Dothraki warriors in a defensive position of their own choosing. The battle that followed was the largest Jon had fought since taking Norvis. His army, now numbering over 12,000 men, faced the assembled might of the remaining Horse Lords in a conflict that would determine the future of the eastern grasslands. Jon deployed his forces with the skill of a seasoned general. His infantry formed the center, their shields locked and spears leveled to receive the inevitable cavalry charge. Archers took position on the flanks, ready to pour arrows into the enemy ranks. The former slaves who had joined his cause fought with the desperation of men who knew that defeat meant a return to bondage. But it was the Dothraki who turned the tide. Drogo led his warriors in a flanking maneuver that caught Khal Moro's forces by surprise, striking them from an unexpected direction just as they committed to their main assault. The sight of Dothraki fighting alongside Jon's army broke the morale of many defenders, who couldn't understand how their own people had come to serve an outsider. Balerian's intervention was brief, but decisive. The great dragon swept low over the battlefield at the crucial moment, his roar echoing across the grasslands like thunder. Horses reared and bolted, throwing their riders and disrupting carefully planned formations. The psychological impact was devastating. Many of the enemy warriors simply fled rather than face the winged death of their oldest legends. Khal Moro himself died in the melee, cut down by Jon's own blade, as he tried to rally his crumbling forces. With their leader dead and their army scattered, the remaining Dothraki had little choice but to surrender or face annihilation. The aftermath of victory found Jon standing on a hill overlooking the battlefield, surveying the cost of his triumph. The grass was stained red with blood, and the cries of wounded men and horses filled the air. It was a sobering reminder that every victory came with a price paid in the lives of those who followed him. But the strategic gains were undeniable. His army now numbered nearly 15,000 men, a force large enough to challenge even the Golden Company on favorable terms. More importantly, he had proven that the supposedly invincible Dothraki could be defeated and integrated into a larger military structure. "The men are calling you the Khal," as Drogo reported as he approached Jon's position. The old warrior's face bore new scars from the recent battle, but his eyes held a respect that hadn't been there before. "They say the gods have marked you for greatness." Jon nodded thoughtfully. Titles and honors were useful tools, but they could also become chains if one wasn't careful. The key was to use them without being defined by them. "What matters is what we do with this victory," Jon replied. "The Golden Company will not wait for us to be ready. We need to move quickly to our next objective." He gestured toward the map spread on a nearby table, its surface marked with the positions of various free cities. His finger traced a route toward the nearest target, a wealthy trading center that would provide both resources and strategic position for the battles ahead. "Qohor," he said simply. "It's time to liberate another city." The sun was setting over the Dothraki Sea, as Jon's expanded army began its march toward the next phase of the campaign. Behind them, the grasslands bore the scars of recent battles, but ahead lay new challenges and opportunities. The Wolf of Fire had proven himself against the Horse Lords, but greater tests awaited. As Balerion soared overhead, his great wings catching the last light of day, Jon reflected on how far he had come from the bastard boy of Winterfell. He commanded an army of 15,000 men, had dragons at his beck and call, and bore a secret that could shake the foundations of the known world. But with power came responsibility, and with responsibility came the weight of countless lives depending on his decisions. Every choice he made would ripple outward, affecting not just his immediate followers, but the future of entire nations. The Game of Thrones was vast and complex, played across continents and generations. But Jon was no longer a piece on someone else's board. He was a player now, with his own army, his own dragons, and his own vision of how the world should be shaped. The Dothraki had been conquered, but they were just the beginning. Greater challenges lay ahead, and Jon intended to meet them with fire and blood if necessary. The Wolf of Fire was coming, and the world would never be the same. The morning mist clung to the ancient black walls of Qohor like a funeral shroud, and Jon Snow felt the weight of destiny pressing down upon him as he surveyed the city from atop a low hill. Behind him stretched an army of 15,000 men, former slaves, sellswords, and Dothraki warriors united under his banner. The sight should have filled him with pride, but instead he felt only the cold calculation of a general preparing for what might be his most difficult conquest yet. Balerion perched on a rocky outcropping nearby, his massive form no longer the hatchling that had once rested on Jon's shoulders. The dragon had grown to the size of a small building, his black scales gleaming like polished obsidian in the pale light. When he stretched his wings, they cast shadows large enough to cover a dozen men, and his roar could be heard for miles across the countryside. Yerdi remained in Norvos with Tormund, but Balerion's presence alone was enough to strike fear into the hearts of any who opposed them. "The scouts have returned, my lord," Marcus Blackwood announced, approaching with a leather satchel full of reports. The weathered knight's face was grim as he spread the intelligence documents across a makeshift table. "The situation is worse than we hoped." Jon studied the maps and reports, his gray eyes moving methodically across the information his spies had gathered. Qohor was one of the wealthiest free cities, its prosperity built on the legendary skill of its blacksmiths and its strategic position along the trade routes, but wealth meant little if it couldn't be defended. 8,500 soldiers, Jon read aloud. Professional troops, well-equipped and disciplined. The walls are 20 feet high and reinforced with iron bands forged by their own smiths. "There's more," Marcus said grimly. "Our contacts in the city report that emissaries from the Golden Company arrived 3 days ago. They're negotiating a contract to reinforce Qohor's defenses." The news hit Jon like a physical blow. The Golden Company, 20,000 of the finest mercenaries in the known world, had been gathering to crush his rebellion. If they reached Qohor before he could take the city, his numerical advantage would evaporate overnight. "How long before they arrive?" Jon asked, his voice deadly calm. 2 weeks. Perhaps 3 if the weather holds, Marcus replied. "But my lord, even without them, Qohor won't be easy to take. The city has never fallen to siege in over 400 years. Jon nodded thoughtfully, his mind already working through the tactical challenges ahead. Qohor's black walls were famous throughout Essos, forged from iron and stone by master craftsmen who had perfected their art over centuries. The city's defenders were professionals, not the mixture of guards and militia they had faced in previous conquests. "Gather the war council," Jon commanded. "We march within the hour." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity as Jon's army prepared for what would be their most ambitious campaign yet. Supply trains were organized, siege equipment was loaded onto wagons, and the various commanders received their orders for the march ahead. The Doske were particularly eager, their horses stamping and snorting as they sensed their riders' anticipation for battle. Jogo approached as Jon was checking his weapons, the old blood rider's scarred face bearing an expression of concern. "Coal of Coals," he said, using the title the Horse Lords had given Jon after his conquest of their people. "My riders speak of omens. The crows fly in circles and the horses are restless. Perhaps we should consult the Dosh Colleen before—" "There's no time for omens," Jon interrupted, though not unkindly. He had learned to respect Dothraki customs, but he couldn't afford to let superstition delay his plans. "The Golden Company draws closer with every day we waste. If we're going to take Qohor, it has to be now." The march to Qohor took 2 days across rolling countryside dotted with farms and small villages. Jon's army moved with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine, each unit knowing its role and executing it flawlessly. The sight of 15,000 armed men accompanied by a dragon was enough to send most civilians fleeing, but Jon made sure his soldiers maintained discipline. He needed the local population's cooperation, not their hatred. As they crested the final hill before Qohor, Jon got his first clear view of the city that had defied conquerors for centuries. The black walls rose from the earth like a natural formation, their iron-reinforced stones gleaming dully in the afternoon sun. Beyond the walls, he could see the spires and towers of the inner city, smoke rising from countless forges where the legendary smiths plied their trade. "Impressive," Daenerys commented, riding up beside Jon. The flamboyant sellsword's usual grin was notably absent as he studied the fortifications ahead. "I can see why they've never fallen. Those walls look like they could stop a giant." "Walls are only as strong as the men who defend them," Jon replied, but privately he had to admit that Qohor's defenses were formidable. The city sat on a natural rise, its walls following the contours of the land to maximize their defensive advantage. Catapults and ballistas were visible on the ramparts, their crews already preparing for the siege they knew was coming. Jon's army deployed in a wide semicircle around the city's landward side, close enough to threaten an assault, but far enough back to avoid the defenders' artillery. Siege engines were assembled with practiced efficiency, while engineers surveyed the walls for potential weak points. The Dothraki took position on the flanks, their mobility allowing them to respond quickly to any sally from the gates. As the sun began to set, Jon rode forward under a banner of parley, accompanied only by Marcus and a small escort. The great gates of Qohor remained firmly closed, but he could see figures moving on the walls above. When he reached speaking distance, a voice called down from the ramparts. "I am Magister Horano, first speaker of Qohor," the voice announced. "State your business, Wolf of Fire." Jon looked up at the figure on the wall, a middle-aged man in rich robes, flanked by guards in the distinctive armor of Qohor's professional soldiers. "I am Jon Snow, and I come with an offer. Surrender your city, and your people will be treated with honor. Your soldiers may join my army or depart in peace. Your craftsmen will continue their work under my protection." Horano's laugh echoed off the walls. "You offer us mercy? We are Qohorik. Our walls have never fallen. Our forges have never been extinguished. The Golden Company comes to our aid, and then we shall see who offers mercy to whom." "The Golden Company is still weeks away," Jon replied calmly. "You have until dawn to reconsider. After that, I will take your city by force, and the terms will be far less generous." He turned his horse and rode back to his lines without waiting for a response. The die was cast. Qohor would not surrender peacefully, and Jon would have to take it by storm. The prospect filled him with both anticipation and dread. Every siege was a gamble, and the stakes had never been higher. That night, Jon's army prepared for battle with the methodical efficiency of veterans. Weapons were sharpened, armor was checked and rechecked, and the siege engines were loaded with their deadly projectiles. Around the campfires, men spoke in quiet voices of the battle to come, their faces reflecting the mixture of fear and determination that preceded every major engagement. Jon walked among his troops, offering words of encouragement and checking on their readiness. The former slaves who had joined his cause looked to him with something approaching worship. He was the man who had broken their chains and given them hope for a better future. The sellswords were more pragmatic, but they respected his tactical skill and his willingness to share the dangers of battle. The Dothraki saw him as a Khal worthy of following, a leader who had proven his strength in single combat. "My lord," came a voice from the darkness. Jon turned to see one of his scouts approaching, the man's face grim with urgent news. "We've intercepted a message from the city. They're expecting reinforcements from Norvos. 1,000 men arriving tomorrow night." Jon felt his jaw tighten. Norvos was supposed to be under his control, but apparently some loyalists had escaped and were now coming to Qohor's aid. The situation was becoming more complicated by the hour. "Double the patrols," Jon ordered. "I want to know about any force approaching the city, no matter how small. And send word to Tormund. I want to know how 1,000 men managed to slip past our garrison." Dawn broke gray and cold over the siege lines, and with it came the sound of war horns echoing from Qohor's walls. Jon's army formed up in attack formation, their banners snapping in the morning breeze. Siege engines rolled forward, their crews protected by wooden shields and mantlets. Archers took position within range of the walls, their quivers full and their bowstrings taut. Jon sat astride his black destrier, at the center of his battle line, Longclaw hanging at his side, and his armor gleaming in the pale light. Balerion perched on a hill behind the army, his great head turned toward the city, and his eyes reflecting an ancient hunger for battle. "Begin the bombardment," Jon commanded. The siege engines roared to life, hurling stones and bolts at Qohor's black walls. The defenders responded with their own artillery, and soon the air was filled with the whistle of projectiles and the crash of stone on stone. Dust and debris filled the air as both sides sought to gain the advantage through superior firepower. But Jon's secret weapon was not made of wood and iron. At his signal, Balerion spread his massive wings and took to the air, his shadow passing over the battlefield like a cloud. The dragon's roar echoed off the walls of Qohor, and Jon could see defenders pointing and shouting as the creature from their nightmares circled overhead. Balerion's first pass over the walls was purely psychological, a demonstration of power designed to break the defenders' morale. But when arrows began to fly up at the dragon, Jon's patience ran out. He gave Balerion the signal to attack, and the great beast responded with a gout of flame that turned a section of the wall into molten slag. The sight of their supposedly impregnable fortifications melting like candle wax sent shockwaves through the defending army. Some men threw down their weapons and fled, while others redoubled their efforts to drive off the attackers. But the psychological damage was done. Qohor's walls were no longer invincible. Jon pressed his advantage, ordering a general assault while the defenders were still reeling from the dragon attack. His infantry advanced in disciplined ranks, their shields locked and their spears leveled. Ladders were thrown up against the walls, while sappers worked to undermine the foundations. The Dothraki rode hard against the gates, their arrows finding gaps in the defenders' armor. The battle for Qohor's walls was brutal and chaotic. Defenders poured boiling oil and molten metal down on the attackers, while Jon's men fought with the desperation of those who knew that failure meant death or slavery. Balerion made several more passes, each one opening new breaches in the fortifications and spreading panic among the defenders. By midday, Jon's forces had gained a foothold on the walls. The first of his banners was planted on the ramparts, followed quickly by others as his men poured through the breaches. The defenders fought with professional skill and desperate courage, but they were outnumbered and demoralized by the dragon's attacks. The fighting in the streets was even more vicious than the assault on the walls. Khosiar's soldiers knew every alley and building, turning each intersection into a potential ambush. Jon's men had to fight for every yard, clearing buildings one by one and rooting out defenders who refused to surrender. Jon himself led the assault on the city's central square, where the last organized resistance had gathered around the Temple of the Black Goat. The defenders had barricaded themselves behind overturned carts and market stalls, their crossbows and spears creating a deadly obstacle for any who tried to approach. "Surrender," Jon called out, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "Your walls have fallen. Your gates are broken. There's no shame in yielding to superior force." The response was a volley of crossbow bolts that forced Jon and his men to take cover behind their shields. It was clear that these defenders would fight to the death rather than submit to conquest. Jon felt a familiar coldness settle over him, the same icy detachment that had carried him through countless battles. "Liberion," he called, and the great dragon descended from the sky like a falling star. The beast's roar echoed off the buildings surrounding the square, and his eyes fixed on the barricaded defenders with predatory intensity. This time, Jon's command was specific and limited. Balerion's flame licked out in a controlled burst, not the devastating torrent that could level buildings, but a precise strike that turned the defenders' barricades to ash without harming the surrounding structures. The message was clear: surrender or burn. The sight of their defenses literally melting away broke the last of the defenders' resolve. Weapons clattered to the ground as men threw up their hands in surrender, their faces reflecting the shock of seeing their world turned upside down in a matter of hours. The battle for Qohor was over, but the cost had been significant. Jon's forces had lost nearly 1,000 men in the assault, while the defenders had suffered even heavier casualties. The streets were littered with the dead and wounded, and smoke rose from buildings that had been damaged in the fighting. Jon established his headquarters in the former palace of the Magisters, a sprawling complex of marble halls and ornate chambers that spoke of centuries of accumulated wealth. But his first priority was not luxury. It was establishing order and preventing the kind of chaos that could turn victory into disaster. "No looting," he commanded his officers, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man who had brooked no disobedience. Any man caught stealing from the civilians will be hanged. We're liberators, not bandits. The order was not popular with some of his men, particularly the sellswords who saw plunder as their rightful reward for victory. But Jon's reputation for swift and brutal punishment of those who disobeyed his commands was well established and discipline held. Instead of allowing his army to sack the city, Jon implemented a carefully planned occupation. Food stores were opened to feed the hungry. Medical aid was provided to the wounded regardless of which side they had fought on, and the city's essential services were restored as quickly as possible. The message was clear: life under Jon's rule would be better than what had come before. The integration of Qohor's surviving soldiers into Jon's army was a delicate process. Of the original 8,500 defenders, 1,500 had died in the fighting and another 1,000 had fled during the chaos of the assault. That left 7,000 professional soldiers who had to be convinced to serve their former enemy. Jon handled the matter personally, addressing the assembled prisoners in the city's great square. He stood before them without armor or weapons, flanked only by his personal guard, while Balerion perched on a nearby rooftop like a living reminder of the power that had brought them low. "You fought with honor," Jon began, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "Your city has fallen, but you have not been dishonored. I offer you a choice. Join my army and help me build something better than what came before, or depart in peace with your weapons and your dignity intact." The response was mixed. Some men stepped forward immediately, drawn by Jon's reputation and the promise of steady pay and fair treatment. Others remained skeptical, unwilling to serve the man who had destroyed their city. But as the days passed and Jon's administration proved both competent and fair, more and more of the former defenders chose to take his oath. The city's famous blacksmiths presented a different challenge. These were not soldiers but craftsmen, their skills too valuable to lose, but their loyalty uncertain. Jon met with their guild leaders in the great forge that was the heart of Qohor's economy, the air thick with smoke and the ring of hammers on steel. "Your work is legendary throughout the known world," Jon told them, his words carefully chosen to appeal to their professional pride. "I have no intention of disrupting that. Continue your craft, and I will ensure you have all the materials and protection you need. In return, I ask only that you consider taking on some additional contracts, weapons, and armor for my army." The master smiths conferred among themselves in their ancient guild language before their spokesman, a grizzled man named Caro, stepped forward. "We have heard of your dragons, Wolf of Fire. Some say they are forged of living flame, others that they are demons from the deepest hells. What do you say?" Jon smiled, understanding the test being offered. "I say they are dragons, nothing more and nothing less. But if you wish to see for yourself—" He gave a low whistle, and Balerion descended from his perch with a thunderous beating of wings. The great dragon landed in the courtyard outside the forge, his massive head turning to regard the assembled smiths with ancient, intelligent eyes. The smiths stared in awe and terror, but their professional curiosity quickly overcame their fear. They began to circle the dragon, pointing out details of his construction to each other in excited whispers. Here was the ultimate expression of their craft, a creature forged not of metal but of flesh and fire, yet following the same principles of form and function that guided their work. "We will forge for you," Caro announced finally, "but we ask one thing in return. Allow us to study your dragon, to understand how the ancient smiths of Valyria created such perfection." Jon nodded his agreement, knowing that the smith's cooperation would be crucial for equipping his growing army. The weapons and armor produced in Qohor were among the finest in the world, and having access to that expertise would give his forces a significant advantage in the battles to come. As the days passed, Jon's administration of Qohor settled into a routine. The city's essential functions were restored, trade began to flow again, and the population gradually accepted their new rulers. Jon made a point of being visible in the streets, listening to complaints and addressing problems as they arose. It was exhausting work, but it was necessary to build the kind of loyalty that would endure when he moved on to his next conquest. The integration of Qohor's forces into his army brought Jon's total strength to nearly 20,000 men, a formidable force by any standard. But he knew that numbers alone would not be enough. When the Golden Company finally arrived, he needed every advantage he could get, and that meant continuing to expand his power base. "My lord," Marcus Blackwood announced, entering Jon's temporary office with a collection of reports. "The scouts have returned from the east. The news is troubling." Jon looked up from the maps he had been studying, noting the grim expression on his knight's face. "What is it?" The Golden Company has crossed the narrow sea, Marcus replied, spreading a fresh map across the table. 20,000 men, just as we expected. But they're not coming directly for us. They've landed at Pentos and are gathering supplies for a major campaign. Jon studied the new intelligence, his mind racing through the implications. Pentos was several weeks' march from Qohor, which gave him time to prepare. But it also meant that the Golden Company was taking this threat seriously enough to make careful preparations rather than rushing into battle. How long do we have? Jon asked. 6 weeks, perhaps 8 if they encounter delays, Marcus replied. But my lord, there's more. Our contacts in Pentos report that they're not just hiring the Golden Company, they're assembling a coalition. Tyrosh, Lys, and Myr are all contributing forces. We could be facing 30,000 men or more. The news was sobering, but not entirely unexpected. Jon had known from the beginning that his rebellion would eventually provoke a massive response from the established powers. The Free Cities had too much to lose to allow his movement to succeed without a fight. Then we need to be ready for them, Jon said simply. Double the recruitment efforts, increase weapon production, and begin fortifying our positions. If they want a war, we'll give them one. They'll never forget. That evening, Jon stood on the highest tower of Qohor's palace, looking out over the city he had conquered, and the army he had built. The sight should have filled him with satisfaction, but instead he felt only the weight of the challenges ahead. 20,000 soldiers was an impressive force, but it might not be enough against the coalition gathering against him. Balerion perched on a nearby rooftop, his great wings folded against his sides as he rested after a day of flying patrols around the city. The dragon had grown even larger since their arrival in Qohor, his body now the size of a small building and his wingspan broad enough to cast shadows over entire city blocks. When he took flight, his wings seemed to blot out the sun itself. The sight of his dragon reminded Jon of the power he wielded, but also of its limitations. Balerion was a devastating weapon in battle, but he was still just one creature. Against 30,000 enemies, even a dragon could be overwhelmed if the enemy was clever and determined enough. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," Jon called, and Jogo stepped into the chamber. The old Blood Rider's face was troubled, and he carried a message scroll in his weathered hands. "Khal of Khal," Jogo said, offering the scroll. "This came from our riders in the north. The news is unexpected." Jon took the message and broke the seal, his eyes scanning the contents quickly. As he read, his expression grew increasingly grim. The message was from one of his spies in Norvos, and it contained information that changed everything. "What is it, my lord?" Marcus asked, entering the chamber behind Jogo. Jon looked up from the scroll, his gray eyes reflecting the weight of new knowledge. The 1,000 men who escaped Norvos, they weren't just reinforcements for Qohor. They were scouts, gathering intelligence for the Golden Company. Our enemies know our strength, our positions, our capabilities. The implications were staggering. The Golden Company was not just assembling a large army, they were preparing a carefully planned campaign based on detailed intelligence about Jon's forces. Every advantage he thought he possessed might already be countered by enemy preparations. "Then we need to change the game," Jon said, his voice carrying the cold determination that his men had learned to recognize. "If they think they know us, we'll show them how wrong they are." He moved to the great map that dominated one wall of the chamber, his finger tracing routes across the painted landscape. "Send word to Tormund in Norvos and to our agents in the other free cities. It's time to accelerate our plans." "What are you thinking, my lord?" Marcus asked. Jon's smile was sharp as a blade. "The Golden Company expects to face us here, in a defensive siege, where their numbers will tell. Instead, we're going to take the fight to them. We'll strike where they least expect it, when they least expect it." He turned to face his assembled commanders, his eyes reflecting the fire that had earned him his reputation. "The Wolf of Fire is done playing defense. It's time to remind the world why dragons are feared." As the night deepened over Qohor, Jon's war council worked through the details of a plan that would either secure their victory or ensure their destruction. The stakes had never been higher, and the margin for error had never been smaller. But Jon had not come this far by playing it safe. The Golden Company was coming, backed by the combined might of the free cities, but they would find that the Wolf of Fire had learned new tricks, and that dragons were not so easily caged. The real war was about to begin, and Jon intended to win it with fire and blood. In the distance, thunder rumbled across the darkening sky, and Balerion raised his great head to taste the wind. Storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, both literal and metaphorical. But Jon Snow had weathered storms before, and he would weather this one too. The black walls of Qohor had fallen, and with them had fallen the last illusion that the free cities were invincible. Now it was time to prove that dragons could not be tamed, and that the fire of liberation would burn across all of Essos before it was done. Varys, the spider. In the dim light of my chambers, I ponder the recent events unfolding in Essos. Jon Snow, the so-called Wolf of Fire, has proven himself a formidable player on this grand chessboard. His conquest of Qohor, a city long thought impregnable, speaks volumes of his growing influence and the power he wields. The whispers of the streets tell tales of his dragon, Balerion, casting shadows over the hearts of men. Dragons are not mere beasts, they are symbols of power, and in the hands of one who understands their significance, they can reshape the world. Jon's victory has not only bolstered his own ranks, but has also sent ripples through the free cities. Yet, I must wonder, what will be the cost of this newfound strength? The Golden Company gathers, and with it, a coalition of the free cities seeks to quash this rebellion before it gains further momentum. Jon Snow has ignited a fire, but fires can consume as easily as they can warm. I must tread carefully, for alliances are as fragile as glass. I have my own interests to protect, and I see the potential in Jon. He embodies the hope of the common folk, yet he is still a pawn in a game far larger than he realizes. I must keep my eyes on him, for the winds of fate can shift swiftly, and I must be ready to adapt. Petyr Baelish, Littlefinger, Jon Snow, the boy who was once a mere bastard of Winterfell, has transformed into a man of consequence, commanding armies and dragons. His recent conquest of Qohor is a testament to his ambition, but ambition alone does not win wars. Cunning does. I've always believed that chaos breeds opportunity, and Jon's rise is no exception. The Golden Company, a force of mercenaries, now seeks to crush him. How delightful! A conflict between two powerful entities can create a vacuum, and in that vacuum, I can insert myself. What intrigues me most is Jon's naivete. He believes he fights for a noble cause, yet he is surrounded by the very elements that could lead to his downfall. The Dothraki, once a proud people, now serve him, but loyalty among horse lords is as fleeting as a summer breeze. I must position myself wisely. Perhaps I can offer my services to Jon to guide him through the treacherous waters ahead. A man with a dragon is a man to be reckoned with. But even dragons can be brought low. If I play my cards right, I might find a way to turn Jon's strength into a weakness, ensuring that I remain the master of this game. Tywin Lannister. Jon Snow's actions in Qohor are both impressive and alarming. The boy has managed to unite a disparate group of former slaves, sellswords, and Dothraki under a single banner, and he has done so with the aid of a dragon. This is not merely a rebellion, it is a challenge to the established order of power in Westeros and beyond. His conquest of Qohor cannot be dismissed lightly. The city has withstood sieges for centuries, and yet he has taken it with a combination of brute force and psychological warfare. This speaks to a level of strategic thinking that I had not attributed to him. Perhaps I underestimated the boy. However, he is still a threat to the Lannister legacy. The Golden Company, a mercenary force of exceptional skill, is now gathering to confront him. I must ensure that they succeed. A divided Westeros is a weak Westeros, and a strong Jon Snow could unify the realms against us. It would be prudent to reinforce our own position while seeking to undermine his. The realm must remain stable, and I will not allow a dragon to disrupt the delicate balance of power. I will need to consult with my allies and consider how best to extinguish this flame before it spreads beyond control. Jon Snow may be a man of the people, but the people can be fickle. I will ensure that they remember who truly holds the power in this game of thrones. The morning sun cast long shadows across the muddy banks of the Rhine as Jon Snow surveyed the battlefield that would determine the fate of his rebellion. 22,000 men stood arrayed behind him in disciplined formations, their banners snapping in the river breeze. Former slaves stood shoulder to shoulder with Dothraki horsemen. Sellswords from a dozen companies and the professional soldiers of 3 conquered free cities. It was the largest army he had ever commanded. Yet Jon felt the familiar cold knot of uncertainty in his stomach as he studied the enemy positions across the water. The Golden Company had chosen their ground well. 18,000 of the finest mercenaries in the known world were deployed on the eastern bank of the road, their golden banners gleaming like captured sunlight. But it was not their numbers that concerned Jon most. It was the massive gray shapes moving among their ranks like living fortresses. War elephants, dozens of them, their tusks capped with iron and their backs bearing wooden towers bristling with spears and crossbows. Balurion perched on a rocky outcropping behind Jon's lines, his massive form no longer able to rest anywhere near human habitation without causing panic. The dragon had grown to the size of a small building, his black scales gleaming like polished obsidian in the morning light. When he spread his wings to stretch them, they cast shadows large enough to cover entire companies of men. His great head turned toward the enemy across the river, nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of the war elephants that had been brought specifically to counter his presence. "The elephants are the key," Marcus Blackwood said, riding up beside Jon with a spyglass in his weathered hands. "Take them out of the equation and their formations will crumble. But those mahouts know their business. They've chained the beasts together and positioned them to support each other." Jon nodded grimly, studying the enemy deployment through his own glass. The Golden Company's reputation was well-deserved. Their formations were textbook perfect, with infantry squares protected by cavalry on the flanks and the war elephants positioned to break any charge. Their commander, whoever he was, clearly understood the threat posed by dragons and had prepared accordingly. "What word from our scouts?" Jon asked. "The river is fordable in 3 places," Marcus replied, consulting his notes. "Here, where we stand, and 2 leagues north and south. The enemy has positioned forces to cover all 3 crossings, but they're strongest here at the center." Behind them, Jon's army was a study in controlled tension. The Dothraki sat their horses with predatory patience, their curved swords gleaming as they awaited the order to charge. The former slaves who had flocked to Jon's banner gripped their spears with white knuckles, knowing that defeat would mean a return to bondage or death. The professional soldiers from Norvos, Saltshore, and Qohor maintained their discipline, but Jon could see the uncertainty in their eyes as they faced the legendary Golden Company. "My lord," came a voice from behind. Jon turned to see Jorgo approaching, the old blood rider's scarred face bearing an expression of concern. "The horses smell the great beasts across the water. They are restless, afraid. Perhaps we should strike at one of the other crossings, where there are fewer of the gray monsters." It was sound tactical advice, but Jon shook his head. The Golden Company expected him to avoid their strength, to seek an easier path to victory. That very expectation might be turned against them, if he was bold enough to seize the opportunity. "We attack here," Jon decided, but not in the way they expect. He called for his war council, and within minutes, his senior commanders had gathered around a map spread on the ground. The plan he outlined was audacious to the point of madness, but it was the kind of unexpected gambit that might catch even the Golden Company off guard. "The elephants are their greatest strength and their greatest weakness," Jon explained, his finger tracing movements on the map. "They expect the Ligurian to attack them directly, so that's exactly what we'll do, but not to destroy them. We're going to use them." The looks of confusion on his commanders' faces were almost comical, but Jon pressed on with his explanation. The plan was complex and dangerous, requiring precise timing and no small amount of luck. But if it worked, it would turn the enemy's greatest asset against them. As the morning wore on, both armies made their final preparations for battle. Jon's forces moved into position with the efficiency of veterans, each unit knowing its role in the complex dance of war. Siege engines were positioned to provide covering fire, while cavalry units prepared for rapid redeployment as the battle developed. Across the river, the Golden Company maintained their defensive posture, their discipline evident in the steady ranks and unwavering formations. Jon could see their officers moving among the troops, no doubt delivering final instructions and encouragement. These were professional soldiers, men who had made war their trade and had survived countless battles through skill and experience. The war elephants were the most impressive sight of all. Each beast stood nearly twice the height of a man, their gray hide scarred from previous battles, and their eyes reflecting an intelligence that was both alien and unsettling. The wooden towers on their backs held 4 or 5 warriors each, armed with long spears and powerful crossbows. Iron chains connected the elephants to each other, preventing them from being scattered by panic or enemy action. "Signal the attack," Jon commanded. Ruzio horns echoed across the battlefield as Jon's army began its advance. The first wave consisted of his lightest troops, archers and skirmishers, who could move quickly across the river and establish a foothold on the far bank. They waded into the brown waters of the Rhine under a hail of enemy missiles, their shields raised against the storm of arrows and crossbow bolts. The Golden Company's response was immediate and professional. Their own archers returned fire while their cavalry moved to contain the river crossing. But their attention was focused on the conventional threat, not on the shadow that passed overhead as Balerion took to the air. The Great Dragon's first pass over the enemy lines was devastating in its psychological impact. His roar echoed across the battlefield like thunder, and several of the war elephants trumpeted in alarm as they caught his scent. But the Mahots were experienced handlers, and they managed to keep their charges under control through a combination of sharp commands and iron discipline. Jon had expected this. The Golden Company would not have brought war elephants without ensuring they could function in the presence of dragons, but that very preparation would be turned against them. Balerion's second pass was more targeted. Instead of attacking the elephants directly, the dragon swooped low over the enemy cavalry, his flames turning horses and riders into screaming torches. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, and the surviving horsemen scattered in panic, their formation broken and their effectiveness neutralized. With the enemy cavalry in disarray, Jon's main force began crossing the river in earnest. The Dothraki led the way, their horses splashing through the shallow water with reckless courage. Behind them came the infantry, their shields locked and their spears leveled as they prepared to meet the Golden Company's counterattack. The battle was joined with a crash that could be heard for miles. Steel rang against steel as the two armies collided along the riverbank, neither side giving ground easily. The Golden Company's discipline was evident in their steady ranks and coordinated movements, but Jon's forces fought with the desperation of men who knew that defeat meant death or slavery. It was then that Jon implemented the most dangerous part of his plan. Instead of continuing to harass the enemy cavalry, Balerion turned his attention to the war elephants, but not to destroy them. The dragon's flames licked out in carefully controlled bursts, not the devastating torrents that could melt stone, but precise strikes designed to panic rather than kill. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The war elephants, already nervous from the dragon's presence, broke their training and began to rampage through their own lines. The iron chains that were meant to keep them together became instruments of destruction as panicked beasts dragged their neighbors into the chaos. Mahouts shouted desperate commands as their charges trampled friend and foe alike in their terror. But Jon's satisfaction was short-lived. Even as the war elephants wreaked havoc in the enemy ranks, the Golden Company's officers were rallying their men with professional efficiency. Horns sounded across the battlefield as reserve units moved to contain the damage, while engineers worked frantically to cut the chains binding the elephants together. "They're adapting faster than expected," Marcus Blackwood shouted over the din of battle, his sword bloody from the fighting along the riverbank. "We need to press our advantage before they can reorganize." Jon nodded, raising his own blade as he prepared to join the melee. But as he looked across the battlefield, he realized something that chilled him to the bone. Despite the chaos caused by the panicked elephants, despite the casualties inflicted by Balerion's attacks, the Golden Company was not breaking. These were not militia or city guards who would flee at the first sign of trouble. They were professional soldiers who had faced dragons before and lived to tell the tale. The battle raged for hours along the banks of the Rhine, neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Jane's forces had succeeded in crossing the river and establishing a foothold on the eastern bank, but the Golden Company's disciplined resistance prevented them from exploiting their initial success. Bodies piled up in the muddy water as wave after wave of attacks met stubborn defense. Balerion continued to harass the enemy lines, his flames and roar spreading panic wherever he appeared. But Jon noticed that the dragon's attacks were becoming less effective as the battle progressed. The Golden Company's soldiers were learning to work around the dragon's presence, using covered positions and coordinated movements to minimize their exposure. "My lord!" Drogo's voice cut through the noise of battle as the Blood Rider fought his way to Jon's side. "The Grey Beasts are under control again. Their handlers have cut the chains and separated them." Jon cursed under his breath as he saw the truth of Drogo's words. The war elephants, no longer chained together, were being repositioned by their mahots with professional skill. Instead of being a liability, they were once again becoming the formidable weapons they were meant to be. The tide of battle began to turn. As the Golden Company's superior discipline and experience began to tell, their formations, disrupted by the initial dragon attack, reformed with mechanical precision. Their officers, veterans of countless campaigns, adapted their tactics to account for the dragon's presence, while maintaining pressure on Jon's forces. Jon found himself in the thick of the fighting, Longclaw singing as it cut through enemy armor and flesh. The Valyrian steel blade never seemed to dull, its edge sharp enough to cleave through mail and bone with equal ease. But even as he fought with the skill of a master swordsman, Jon could feel the battle slipping away from him. "Fall back to the river," he commanded, his voice carrying clearly over the battlefield. "Fighting withdrawal, maintain formation." The order was not popular with his men, who had fought so hard to establish their position on the eastern bank, but Jon's reputation for tactical brilliance was well established, and his commanders trusted his judgment even when they didn't understand his reasoning. The withdrawal was conducted with the same discipline that had marked Jon's army throughout the campaign. Units fell back in sequence, each one covering the retreat of the others while maintaining their cohesion. The Dothraki provided mobile screening forces, their hit-and-run tactics preventing the Golden Company from turning the withdrawal into a rout. But the cost was significant. Jon's forces had lost nearly 3,000 men in the fighting, while the Golden Company's casualties were considerably lighter. More importantly, the psychological impact of the defeat was devastating. These men had believed that dragons made them invincible, and the Golden Company had proven otherwise. As his army recrossed the Rhine and took up defensive positions on the western bank, Jon felt the weight of failure pressing down upon him. He had gambled everything on this battle, believing that his superior numbers and dragon support would be enough to crush the legendary mercenary company. Instead, he had learned a harsh lesson about the difference between quantity and quality in warfare. "The men are shaken," Marcus Blackwood reported as the last of the wounded were carried across the river. They expected an easy victory, and instead they'd seen the Golden Company fight dragons to a standstill. Jon nodded grimly, his eyes fixed on the enemy positions across the water. The Golden Company had not pursued his retreat, content to hold their ground and tend to their own wounded. Their discipline was impressive, but it also revealed something important about their commander's mindset. "They're not here to conquer," Jon realized aloud. "They're here to contain us, to prevent us from expanding further east. That's why they didn't press the attack when we withdrew." The implications were staggering. Jon had assumed that the Golden Company intended to crush his rebellion completely. But their tactics suggested a different strategy. They were content to hold him in place while their employers, the remaining free cities, prepared their own responses to his growing power. "Then what do we do?" Marcus asked. "We can't stay here indefinitely. Our supplies won't last, and morale is already suffering from today's defeat." Jon was quiet for a long moment, his mind racing through possibilities and contingencies. The conventional approach, massing his forces for another assault, would likely result in even heavier casualties without guaranteeing success. The Golden Company had proven they could fight dragons and win, at least in a defensive battle. But perhaps that was the key. The Golden Company excelled at defensive warfare, using their discipline and experience to maximum advantage. But what if he could force them to abandon that advantage? What if he could make them come to him? "Send word to Tormund in Norvos," Jon commanded suddenly. "I want every available man marching south within the week, and dispatch riders to our agents in Volantis and Bervelfos. It's time to call in some favors." "My lord?" Marcus looked confused by the sudden change in direction. Jon's smile was sharp as a blade. "The Golden Company thinks they have us contained, but they've made one crucial mistake. They've assumed this is the only battlefield that matters." Over the next several days, Jon's army settled into defensive positions along the western bank of the Rhine while maintaining the appearance of preparing for another assault. Scouts ranged back and forth across the river, probing the enemy lines and gathering intelligence. To outside observers, it looked like Jon was planning another frontal attack against the Golden Company's prepared positions. But the real action was taking place far from the battlefield. Riders galloped north and south, carrying messages to Jon's allies and agents throughout Essos. Gold changed hands in the taverns of Volantis, while ships departed from Braavos carrying mysterious cargo. The network of contacts and favors that Jon had built during his conquests was being activated for a purpose that would soon become clear. The Golden Company, for their part, seemed content to wait. Their defensive positions were strengthened daily, with earthworks and palisades turning the eastern bank into a fortress. The war elephants were kept in reserve, ready to respond to any assault, while patrols ranged along the river to prevent surprise crossings. But their very success in the previous battle had created a problem for the mercenary company. Their employers had hired them to contain Jon's expansion, not to engage in a prolonged siege. The longer they remained in position, the more expensive their services became, and the greater the strain on the Free City's treasuries. Jon was counting on that economic pressure to work in his favor. The Golden Company might be the finest mercenaries in the world, but they were still mercenaries. Their loyalty lasted only as long as their contracts, and contracts could be renegotiated or terminated if the price became too high. "My lord," Yago announced, approaching Jon's command tent with a message scroll. "Word from the north. Tormund's forces are 2 days out, and they bring unexpected allies." Jon broke the seal and read the message quickly, his eyebrows rising as he absorbed the contents. Tormund was indeed approaching with reinforcements, but he had also managed to recruit several bands of sellswords who had grown tired of waiting for employment from the free cities. More importantly, he brought news of political developments that could change the entire strategic situation. "Out of the War Council," Jon commanded. "It's time to implement the next phase of our plan." Within the hour, Jon's senior commanders had assembled in his tent, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity and concern. The defeat at the river crossing had shaken their confidence, but they still trusted their commander's judgment. Jon spread a map across the table and began to outline a strategy that was even more audacious than his previous gambit. "The Golden Company expects us to attack them here," Jon began, his finger pointing to their current position. "They've prepared for every conventional assault we might launch. But what if we don't attack them at all?" The confusion on his commanders' faces was evident, but Jon continued with his explanation. The plan he outlined was complex and risky, requiring coordination across multiple theaters and precise timing. But if it worked, it would force the Golden Company to abandon their advantageous position and fight on terms more favorable to Jon's forces. "The key is to make them choose between their contract and their survival," Jon explained. "Right now, they can afford to wait us out because they hold all the advantages, but if we threaten something they value more than gold, they'll have to move." As the sun set over the Rhine, Jon's army began to implement the new strategy. To outside observers, it looked like they were preparing for another assault, but the real movement was taking place under cover of darkness. Units slipped away from the main camp in small groups, their destinations known only to their commanders and Jon himself. Balerion played a crucial role in the deception, making regular flights over the enemy positions to maintain the illusion that Jon's full attention was focused on the river crossing. The Great Dragon's presence kept the Golden Company's scouts at a distance, preventing them from observing the subtle changes in Jon's deployment. The next morning brought news that changed everything. A messenger arrived at dawn with word from Volantis. The city's ruling council had voted to withdraw their financial support for the Golden Company's contract. The official reason was economic necessity, but Jon's agents had worked tirelessly to convince key council members that continued resistance was futile. Similar messages arrived throughout the day from other free cities. Faced with the prospect of a prolonged and expensive conflict, several of Jon's enemies were reconsidering their commitment to stopping his expansion. The economic warfare that Jon had been waging alongside his military campaigns was finally bearing fruit. But the most important development came from an unexpected source. A small boat approached under a flag of truce, carrying an emissary from the Golden Company itself. The man who stepped ashore was middle-aged and weathered, with the bearing of a professional soldier and the calculating eyes of a merchant. "I am Captain General Miles Toyne," the man announced as he was escorted to Jon's tent. "I come to discuss terms." Jon received the Golden Company's leader with all the courtesy due to a worthy opponent, but his gray eyes remained cold and calculating. This was the man who had fought his forces to a standstill, who had proven that dragons were not invincible. Whatever terms he offered would have to be considered carefully. "Your reputation precedes you, Captain General," Jon said as they settled into chairs across from each other. "The Golden Company's performance yesterday was impressive." Toyne's smile was thin, but genuine, as was yours, Lord Snow. "Few commanders would have had the courage to attack our positions directly, and fewer still would have managed an orderly withdrawal when the assault failed." The two men studied each other like chess players contemplating their next moves. Both were experienced commanders who understood the realities of warfare, but they also represented very different philosophies about the nature of power and loyalty. "My employers are reconsidering their commitment to this conflict," Toyne said finally. "Several cities have already declared that they will withdraw their support if it goes on for longer, and others are wavering. The economic cost of maintaining our services is becoming prohibitive." Jon nodded thoughtfully. This was the opening he had been hoping for, the crack in the enemy coalition that he could exploit. But he also knew that Tain was too experienced to reveal his full hand without getting something in return. "What are you proposing?" Jon asked. "A negotiated settlement," Torn replied. "You withdraw your forces to west of the Rhine and agree not to expand further east for a period of 5 years. In return, the Golden Company withdraws from Essos and seeks employment elsewhere." It was a reasonable offer, the kind of compromise that could end the conflict without further bloodshed. But Jon knew that accepting it would be tantamount to admitting defeat. His rebellion was built on momentum and the promise of inevitable victory. Any sign of weakness could cause his coalition to collapse as quickly as it had formed. "I appreciate the offer," Jon said carefully, "but I'm afraid I must decline. My followers expect me to continue the fight for freedom, not to negotiate with those who would keep them in chains." Toyn nodded as if he had expected this response. "I thought you might say that. In that case, I can only say that in the next battle we will not hold back, and just contain your men. We will finish your forces, once and for all." As night fell over the Rhone, Jon stood on the riverbank and contemplated the events of the day. The battle had been a tactical defeat, but it had also revealed important information about his enemy's capabilities and limitations. More importantly, it had set in motion a chain of events that might ultimately prove more valuable than any military victory. The Lyrian perched nearby, his great head turned toward the enemy camp across the river. The dragon's eyes reflected the firelight from the torches, and Jon could sense his mount's eagerness for another battle. But perhaps the next engagement would be fought with gold and promises mater than fire and steel. The Golden Company had proven that dragons were not invincible. But Jon had learned something equally important, that even the most disciplined mercenaries were still mercenaries at heart. Their loyalty could be bought, and what could be bought could also be sold to the highest bidder. The real war was just beginning, and Jon intended to win it through whatever means necessary. Fire and blood were powerful weapons, but sometimes gold and whispered promises could be even more effective. The Wolf of Fire was learning to play the game of thrones on multiple levels, and his enemies would soon discover that dragons were not his only advantage. The clash at the Rhone had ended in tactical defeat, but Jon Snow was already planning his next move. The Golden Company might have won the battle, but the war was far from over, and when it resumed, it would be fought on terms that even the legendary mercenaries had never encountered before. The Great Hall of Qohor's former palace had been transformed into a war room that would have made the masters of the Citadel weep with envy. Maps covered every surface, from detailed charts of the free cities to rough sketches of trade routes drawn on parchment by Jon's scouts. Candles flickered in iron sconces, casting dancing shadows across the faces of the men who had gathered to decide the fate of Essos. The air was thick with the scent of wax, leather, and the lingering smoke from the braziers that warmed the chamber against the evening chill. Jon Snow sat at the head of a massive oak table that had once hosted the magisters of Qohor in their deliberations over trade and taxation. Now it bore the weight of a different kind of decision, one that would determine whether his rebellion would spread across the continent like wildfire or be snuffed out by the combined might of the free cities. The young man who had once been a bastard of Winterfell had grown into something else entirely during his years in Essos, his gray eyes holding depths that spoke of hard-won wisdom and carefully controlled fury. The defeat at the Rhone still stung, but Jon had learned long ago that dwelling on setbacks was a luxury he could not afford. The Golden Company had proven they could fight dragons to a standstill in a defensive battle, but that very success had revealed important information about their capabilities and limitations. More importantly, it had forced Jon to think beyond the conventional tactics that had served him well in smaller conflicts. Around the table sat the men who had become his inner circle, each representing a different aspect of the coalition he had built. Tormund Giantsbane lounged in his chair with characteristic irreverence, his wild red beard braided with small bones and his weathered hands never far from the massive sword at his side. The wildling chieftain had arrived from Norvos 3 days earlier with 5,000 fresh troops and a collection of colorful stories about the journey south. Hard, Tormund had declared upon seeing the aftermath of the river battle. "So the Golden Boys gave you a bloody nose, did they? About time someone reminded you that you're not invincible, Crow." Despite the crude words, Jon had seen the concern in Tormund's pale blue eyes. The wildling leader understood better than most what it meant to face overwhelming odds, and his presence here was a testament to the loyalty Jon had earned through years of shared hardship. Beside Tormund sat Ser Jorah Mormont, his weathered face bearing the scars of countless battles, and the weight of his complicated past. The exiled knight had proven invaluable as both a military advisor and a link to the noble houses of Westeros. His knowledge of conventional warfare complemented Jon's more unconventional approaches, creating a strategic partnership that had served them well in previous campaigns. The Golden Company fights like Westerosi knights, Jera had observed after studying reports from the rowing battle. Disciplined, professional, but predictable in their methods. We can use that against them. Thoros of Myr occupied his usual position at Jon's right hand, the Red Priest's scarred features reflecting the firelight as he studied the maps with intense concentration. The years had changed Thoros from the drunken priest Jon had first met in King's Landing into something harder and more focused. His faith in Rosor remained absolute, but it was now tempered by practical experience and a deep understanding of the political realities they faced. "The Lord of Light shows us many paths through the flames," Thoros murmured, his fingers tracing trade routes on the map. "But all of them lead through fire and blood." Daenerys sprawled in his chair with practiced nonchalance, his gold tooth gleaming as he smiled at some private joke. The Tyrosi sellsword captain had brought his second sons into Jon's service 2 years earlier, and his knowledge of usse politics had proven invaluable. His flamboyant appearance and casual manner masked a sharp intelligence and ruthless pragmatism that Jon had learned to appreciate. "The free cities think they can buy their way out of this war," Dacrio said, his accented voice carrying a note of amusement. "They've never faced an enemy who couldn't be purchased or intimidated." The Dothraki Khals occupied the far end of the table, their bronze-skinned faces marked by ritual scars and their dark eyes reflecting the firelight like polished obsidian. Khal's Yakko and Khal Pano had initially been rivals, but Jon's dragons and his victories had convinced them to set aside their differences in service of a greater cause. Their combined Khal's numbered nearly 8,000 riders, making them a formidable force on any battlefield. "The Golden Men fight like women," Yakko declared, in his heavily accented common tongue. "They hide behind walls and elephants instead of meeting us in open battle. Which is why they're still alive," Jon replied mildly, earning a grudging nod from the Khal. The Dothraki respected strength above all else, and Jon's willingness to speak plainly to them had earned their loyalty in ways that flattery never could. The discussion that followed was intense and wide-ranging. Touching on everything from supply lines to diplomatic initiatives, Jon listened carefully to each perspective, weighing the merits of different approaches while keeping his own counsel. Leadership, he had learned, was as much about knowing when to speak as when to remain silent. "The problem isn't the Golden Company itself," Marcus Blackwood interjected from his position near the maps. The former sellsword captain had become Jon's chief intelligence officer, his network of contacts throughout Essos providing crucial information about enemy movements and intentions. It's their backers. As long as the free cities keep paying their contracts, they'll keep fighting. "Then we cut off the gold," Jon said simply. "No army fights for free, not even the Golden Company." Tormund laughed, a booming sound that echoed off the stone walls. "Easier said than done, Crow. Those free cities have more gold than sense, and they're spread out like a spider's web. You can't burn them all at once." "Can't we?" Jon's smile was sharp as a blade. "The Illyrian he greeted have grown considerably since our last major campaign. They're no longer hatchlings that can be contained by walls and arrows." The mention of his dragons brought a moment of silence to the room. Everyone present had seen the great beasts in action, had witnessed their terrible power unleashed against Jon's enemies. Beleriand, named for the Black Dread of old, had grown to the size of a small building, his black scales gleaming like polished obsidian and his flames hot enough to melt stone. Ygritte, her crimson and silver scales reflecting her namesake's fiery spirit, was only slightly smaller, but no less deadly. "The dragons are powerful," Jorah acknowledged, "but they're not invincible. The Golden Company proved that at the Roan, we need a strategy that doesn't rely solely on dragon fire." Jon nodded, appreciating the knight's caution, "which is why we're going to fight this war on multiple fronts. Military, economic, and political." He stood and moved to the largest map, his finger tracing the coastlines of the free cities as he outlined his plan. "Our scouts have confirmed that 4 cities pooled their resources to hire the Golden Company: Braavos, Lys, Myr, and Tyresh. Each contributed gold and resources, believing that their combined wealth could purchase our defeat. And now they're about to learn the price of that decision," Thoros said, his voice carrying the certainty of prophecy. Jon's plan was audacious in its scope and complexity. Rather than focusing solely on the Golden Company, he intended to strike at the economic foundations that supported their enemy's war effort. Trade routes would be disrupted, merchant fleets harassed, and key infrastructure targeted for destruction. The free cities had grown rich through commerce and trade. Jon intended to turn that prosperity into a liability. "Dario, I want the Second Sons to begin raiding operations along the Myrish coast," Jon commanded. "Target their fishing fleets and merchant vessels, but avoid civilian casualties where possible. We want them to fear for their livelihoods, not turn them into martyrs." The Tyroshi captain nodded, his gold tooth gleaming. "My men know those waters well. We'll make the Myrish wish they'd never heard of the Golden Company. Kaljako, your riders will strike at the overland trade routes between Pentos and Norvos. Cut the roads, burn the caravans. But again, spare the innocent where you can. We're liberators, not butchers." The Dothraki Khal's scarred face split into a fierce grin. "The grass will run red with the blood of our enemies, but the weak will be spared as you command." Jon turned to Jorah next. "I need you to coordinate with our agents in Volantis and Braavos. The Iron Bank has significant investments in several of the cities opposing us. If we can convince them that continued resistance is bad for business, the Iron Bank's support could shift the entire balance of power," Jorah agreed. "I'll dispatch messages immediately." As the evening wore on, the details of Jon's strategy became clearer. It was a plan that required precise coordination across multiple theaters, with each element supporting the others in a complex web of cause and effect. The Golden Company might be the sword pointed at his heart, but Jon intended to cut off the hand that wielded it. "There's something else," Marcus Blackwood said as the formal planning session began to wind down. "Our spies in Lyce report unusual activity around their naval yards. They're building something big, something they're keeping very secret." Jon frowned, studying the map of the Summer Sea. "Warships? Possibly, or something else entirely. The reports are contradictory. Some say it's a new type of vessel. Others claim it's some kind of weapon." "Keep watching," Jon ordered, "and increase our intelligence gathering in all the free cities. I want to know what they're planning before they know it themselves." As the War Council finally dispersed, Jon remained behind with Thoros and Jorah, the three men studying the maps in contemplative silence. The weight of command sat heavily on Jon's shoulders, but it was a burden he had learned to bear with grace and determination. "You're taking a considerable risk," Jorah observed quietly. "If this plan fails, we'll be fighting on a dozen fronts, simultaneously with no clear path to victory. And if we do nothing, the Golden Company will eventually wear us down through attrition," Jon replied. "They have the advantage in a defensive war. We need to force them to react to us, not the other way around." Thoros stirred the coals in a nearby brazier, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "I have seen visions in the fire," he said softly. "Cities burning, ships sinking beneath dark waters, and dragons soaring over fields of gold. The Lord of Light shows us victory, but the path is treacherous." "When has it ever been otherwise?" Jon asked with a wry smile. "We've come too far to turn back now." The next morning brought a flurry of activity as Jon's orders were implemented across his domain. Riders galloped out of Qohor, carrying sealed messages to agents and allies throughout Essos, while ships departed from captured ports with holds full of supplies and weapons. The great machine of war that Jon had built over the years was shifting into a new configuration, preparing for a conflict unlike any he had fought before. Belian and Yakrides sensed the change in the air, their massive forms restless as they perched on the reinforced towers that had been built to accommodate their size. The dragons were no longer the small creatures that had once ridden on Jon's shoulders. They were weapons of mass destruction that could level cities and incinerate armies. But they were also intelligent beings with their own desires and instincts, and Jon had learned to work with them rather than simply commanding them. "Easy, my friends," he murmured as he approached Bealdrian's perch, the great black dragon lowering his massive head to regard his rider with eyes like molten gold. "Soon we'll have work to do, but not yet." The dragon's rumbling response seemed almost conversational, and Jon found himself wondering, not for the first time, how much the creatures truly understood of human speech and intention. Their bond went deeper than mere training or dominance. It was a connection forged in fire and blood, strengthened by years of shared battles and mutual trust. Reports began arriving within days of the War Council, confirming that Jon's new strategy was already having an impact. Marish fishing boats were returning to port with tales of dragon fire and mysterious raiders, while Dothraki attacks on trade caravans had caused several merchant houses to suspend operations indefinitely. The economic pressure was beginning to build, just as Jon had intended. But the enemy was not passive. Intelligence reports spoke of increased activity in all the free cities. With emergency sessions of ruling councils and frantic diplomatic exchanges, the Golden Company was receiving reinforcements and supplies, while new defensive measures were being implemented to protect key infrastructure. "They're adapting faster than we hoped," Marcus reported during one of their daily briefings. "Braavos has hired additional sellsword companies to protect their merchant fleets, and Tyros is negotiating with the Ironborn for naval support." Jon nodded thoughtfully. Expected. They wouldn't have survived this long if they couldn't adapt to changing circumstances. But adaptation takes time and resources, both of which work in our favor. The true test of Jon's strategy came 2 weeks after the War Council, when reports arrived of a major engagement in the Stepstones. A combined fleet from Lys and Tyros had attempted to break the blockade that Jon's forces had established around the disputed islands, only to encounter Daario's second sons supported by a wing of Dothraki raiders who had learned to fight from ships. The battle had been fierce but brief, with the enemy fleet scattered and several key vessels captured or destroyed. More importantly, the victory had demonstrated that Jon's forces could coordinate effectively across different theaters, adapting their tactics to meet new challenges. "The free cities are beginning to understand what they're truly facing," Thoros observed as they reviewed the battle reports. "Not just a rebellion, but a complete transformation of how war is fought in Essos." Jon's response was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. A ship flying the banner of House Velaryon had arrived in Qohor's harbor, carrying an emissary from Driftmark with a message that would change everything. Lord Qohor Velaryon's representative was a weathered sea captain named Adam, his salt and pepper beard and sun-darkened skin speaking of decades spent on the ocean. He bore a sealed letter from the sea snake himself, along with a proposal that took even Jon by surprise. "My lord offers an alliance," Adam explained, as Jon read the letter in the privacy of his chambers. "House Velaryon has no love for the current regime in King's Landing, and Lord Corlys believes that your cause represents the best hope for meaningful change in the realm." The offer was tempting. House Velaryon commanded one of the largest fleets in Westeros, and their support could tip the balance of power decisively in Jon's favor. But it also represented a significant escalation, transforming his rebellion from a regional conflict in Essos into something that could threaten the Iron Throne itself. "What does Lord Corlys want in return?" Jon asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Recognition of his family's ancient claims and a voice in whatever government emerges from the ashes of the current system." Adam replied, "He's prepared to commit 50 ships and 5,000 men to your cause, with more to follow if the initial campaign proves successful." Jon set the letter aside and moved to the window, gazing out at the city that had become the heart of his growing empire. The decision he made now would echo through history, determining not just his own fate, but the future of 2 continents. "Tell Lord Corlys that I'm honored by his offer," Jon said finally. "But I need time to consider the implications. This war began as a fight for freedom in Essos. Expanding it to Westeros changes everything." After Adam departed, Jon called another emergency session of his War Council. The revelation of Velaryon's offer sparked intense debate among his advisors, with opinions ranging from enthusiastic support to cautious skepticism. "It's an opportunity we can't afford to pass up," Dyer argued. "With Velaryon's fleet, we could strike directly at King's Landing while the Golden Company is tied down here in Essos, and leave our rear exposed to counterattack," Yora countered. "We haven't finished consolidating our gains here. Opening a second front in Westeros could stretch our forces too thin." Tormund's perspective was characteristically blunt. "The Crows got 2 dragons and an army that's never known defeat. Why not use them to take back what's rightfully his?" The debate continued late into the night, but Jon found his thoughts returning to a conversation he'd had with Yerde years earlier before her death had set him on this path. She had spoken of the danger of becoming the very thing you fought against, of letting power corrupt the ideals that had driven you to seek it in the first place. "If they bought the sword to kill me," Jon said finally, his voice cutting through the arguments, "they will taste the fire they paid for. But we finish what we started here first. The free cities made their choice when they hired the Golden Company. Now they'll live with the consequences." The decision to focus on Essos rather than immediately expanding to Westeros was not popular with everyone, but Jon's authority was absolute. He had earned the loyalty of his followers through years of shared struggle and consistent victory, and they trusted his judgment even when they disagreed with his choices. As the War Council dispersed for the final time that evening, Jon remained behind with his maps and his thoughts. The path ahead was clearer now, though no less dangerous. The Golden Company and their backers had forced this conflict upon him, believing that gold and steel could crush his rebellion before it truly began. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The next phase of the war would be unlike anything Essos had seen in generations. Jon Snow, the bastard of Winterfell who had become the Wolf of Fire, was about to show the free cities the true meaning of fire and blood. The dragons were grown, his army was ready, and his enemies had made the fatal mistake of underestimating what he was well to do to protect those who had placed their trust in him. The Council of Fire had spoken, and its judgment would be written across the skies of Essos in flame and shadow. The morning mist clung to the Qohoric plains like a shroud, obscuring the movements of two armies as they prepared for what many would later call the most brutal battle of the Usse Liberation War. Jon Snow stood atop a hastily constructed wooden platform, his gray eyes scanning the fog-shrouded landscape where the Golden Company had made their stand. 3 days had passed since his war council, and already his strategy was bearing fruit, but not in ways he had entirely anticipated. Reports from across Essos painted a picture of chaos and confusion. Daario's raids along the Myrish coast had succeeded beyond expectations, sinking a dozen merchant vessels and capturing enough gold to fund Jon's army for months. The Dothraki strikes on the trade routes had been equally effective, with Khal Jaqo's riders returning with tales of burning caravans and terrified merchants fleeing back to the safety of city walls. But the enemy had adapted faster than Jon had hoped, and now the Golden Company stood reinforced and ready for battle, their ranks swollen with fresh mercenaries hired with the desperate gold of the free cities. "They've got elephants," Tormund observed, his weathered face grim as he studied the enemy lines through a brass spyglass. "Big bastards, too, from the look of them. Haven't seen their like since the old wars in the East." Jon accepted the spyglass and peered through the lifting mist. There, arranged in a formidable line behind the Golden Company's infantry, stood a sight that would have made his ancestors tremble. 12 war elephants, each the size of a small keep, their tusks sheathed in bronze, and their backs bearing wooden towers, bristling with crossbowmen. The beasts swayed restlessly, their trumpeting calls echoing across the battlefield, like the horns of some ancient god. "Volantini, war elephants," Jorah confirmed, his voice tight with concern. "The old blood must have opened their treasuries to fund this. Each one of those beasts is worth more than a warship." The sight should have filled Jon with dread, but instead he felt a familiar calm settling over him. This was the moment he had been preparing for since the defeat at the rowing. A chance to prove that his dragons and his army could overcome any challenge the free cities could purchase. The elephants were impressive, certainly, but they were also a weakness that could be exploited by those clever enough to see it. "Daario," Jon called to the Tyrosi captain, who was adjusting the straps on his ornate armor. "How do your men feel about fighting elephants?" The sellsword's gold tooth gleamed as he grinned. "My boys have fought everything from shadowcats to krakens. A few overgrown horses with long noses won't scare them." Despite his confident words, Jon could see the tension in Daenerys' shoulders. The Second Sons were brave fighters, but war elephants were a different matter entirely. These weren't wild beasts to be avoided or hunted. They were living siege engines, trained for war and capable of trampling entire companies of infantry beneath their massive feet. Thoros approached the platform, his red robes billowing in the morning breeze. The priest's scarred face was serene, but his eyes held the distant look that came when he gazed into flames and saw visions of what might be. "The Lord of Light has shown me fire and shadow dancing together," Thoros said quietly, his voice carrying only to Jon's ears. "Great beasts falling, but not without cost. Victory will come, but it will taste of ash and blood." Jon nodded, unsurprised by the prophecy. Every victory in this war had come with a price, and he had no reason to expect this battle to be different. The question was whether the cost would be worth paying, whether his forces could endure what was to come. The sound of horns echoed across the battlefield as both armies began their final preparations. Jon's forces numbered nearly 15,000, a mixture of freed slaves, Dothraki horsemen, sellswords, and wildlings who had followed him across the narrow sea. They were outnumbered by the Golden Company's 20,000 professional soldiers, but Jon had learned long ago that numbers alone did not determine the outcome of battles. "Remember the plan," Jon addressed his commanders one final time. "We draw them out, make them think we're retreating in disorder. The elephants will charge first. They always do. That's when we spring the trap." Khal Jacko spat into the dust, his scarred face twisted with anticipation. "The great beasts will burn like grass in summer. My riders are ready." "And if the plan fails?" Marcus Blackwood asked, ever the pragmatist. Jon's smile was sharp as Valyrian steel. "Then we improvise. We've done it before." The battle began with the traditional exchange of arrows and insults, both armies testing each other's resolve without committing to a full engagement. Jon watched from his position behind the lines as his archers sent volleys of arrows arcing through the morning air, most of them falling harmlessly against the Golden Company's shields and armor. The enemy responded in kind, their crossbow bolts whistling overhead like angry wasps. It was all theater, of course, a deadly dance that both sides understood. The real battle would begin when one commander decided the time was right to commit his forces fully. Jon intended to make that decision for his enemy. "Signal the retreat," he commanded, his voice carrying clearly across the field. Horns sounded across Jon's lines, and his army began what appeared to be a panicked withdrawal. Units broke formation and fled toward the rear, their banners wavering as if in genuine fear. It was a masterful performance, one that Jon's forces had practiced extensively during their march from Qohor. To the Golden Company, it must have looked like their reputation alone had shattered their enemy's resolve. Captain General Miles Toyne, commanding the Golden Company from his position behind the elephant line, took the bait exactly as Jon had hoped. The golden-haired sellsword raised his sword high, and the war horns of the Golden Company sounded the advance. 20,000 professional soldiers began their march across the plain, their disciplined ranks maintaining perfect formation even as they quickened their pace. But it was the elephants that truly mattered. The 12 great beasts lumbered forward at the center of the Golden Company's advance, their massive feet shaking the ground with each step. The towers on their backs swayed like ships in a storm, but the crossbowmen within maintained their positions with admirable discipline. These were not wild animals, they were weapons of war, trained and deadly. Jon watched the advance through his spyglass, counting heartbeats as the enemy drew closer to the killing ground he had prepared. His retreating forces had passed the markers his scouts had placed the night before, piles of stones that looked natural, but marked the exact range where his dragons could strike most effectively. "Not yet," he murmured as Tormund shifted restlessly beside him. "Let them commit fully." The Golden Company's advance was a thing of terrible beauty. Their ranks moved with mechanical precision, shields locked and spears leveled, while their cavalry protected the flanks and their archers provided covering fire. It was the kind of textbook advance that military scholars would study for generations, executed by some of the finest soldiers gold could buy, which made what happened next all the more devastating. Jon raised his hand, and across the battlefield, hidden signals were passed from unit to unit. His retreating forces suddenly wheeled about with practiced precision, revealing that their panic had been nothing more than an elaborate ruse. Crossbowmen emerged from concealed positions, their weapons trained on the advancing elephants. Dothraki riders who had been hidden in the tall grass rose like phantoms, their curved swords gleaming in the morning sun. But the real surprise came from above. Balerion descended from the clouds like a black thunderbolt, his massive wings blotting out the sun as he dove toward the elephant line. The great dragon had grown tremendously since the early days of Jon's rebellion, his body now the size of a small building, and his wingspan broad enough to cast shadows over entire companies of men. His roar shook the earth as he opened his jaws and unleashed a torrent of dragon fire that turned the morning air into a furnace. The lead elephant disappeared in a column of flame that rose 50 feet into the air. The beast's agonized trumpeting was cut short as the fire consumed it entirely, leaving nothing but charred bones and melted bronze. The wooden tower on its back simply vanished, its occupants incinerated before they could even scream. Yaxley followed her mate's example, the crimson and silver dragon striking from the east with equal fury. Her flames were slightly cooler than Balerian's, but no less deadly, washing over 2 more elephants and setting their riders ablaze. The great beast stumbled and fell, their death throes crushing dozens of Golden Company soldiers who had been advancing behind them. The effect on the Golden Company's morale was immediate and catastrophic. These were professional soldiers, men who had faced death in a dozen different forms, but nothing in their experience had prepared them for the sight of dragons unleashing their fury at close range. The perfect formations began to waver as men looked skyward in terror, their discipline cracking under the weight of primal fear. But Captain General Toyne was not a man to be easily intimidated. Jon watched through his spyglass as the Golden Company's commander rallied his troops with voice and sword, driving them forward even as dragons circled overhead like harbingers of doom. The surviving elephants were goaded into a charge, their mahots using iron-tipped prods to drive the terrified beast toward Jon's lines. "Now we see what they're truly made of," Jon murmured, drawing his sword as he prepared to join the melee personally. What followed was chaos in its purest form. The surviving war elephants crashed into Jon's front lines like living battering rams, their tusks goring men and horses alike while the crossbowmen in their towers rained death from above. But Jon's forces were ready for them, having prepared specific tactics for dealing with the great beasts. Donkey riders swarmed around the elephants like wolves around a bear, their horses dancing just out of reach of the deadly tusks while their riders sent arrow after arrow into the beast's flanks. The arrows alone wouldn't kill the elephants quickly, but they would weaken and enrage them, making them harder for their handlers to control. Meanwhile, Jon's infantry employed a tactic borrowed from ancient Githzerai texts. Teams of men with long spears and nets worked together to entangle the elephants' legs, bringing the great beasts crashing to the ground where they could be finished with swords and axes. It was dangerous work that cost lives, but it was effective. The battle raged for hours, the outcome swinging back and forth like a pendulum. Jon found himself in the thick of the fighting, his Valyrian steel blade carving through Golden Company soldiers as he led his men by example. The familiar rhythm of combat settled over him. Parry, thrust, dodge, strike, each movement flowing into the next with deadly precision. It was during one such exchange that disaster nearly struck. Jon had become separated from his bodyguards while pursuing a group of fleeing crossbowmen, and suddenly found himself facing 3 Golden Company sergeants who had recognized him and moved to claim the bounty on his head. Their swords came at him from 3 different angles, and for a moment Jon thought his luck had finally run out. The first blade he caught on his crossguard, the Valyrian steel ringing like a bell as it turned aside the common steel. The second he ducked under, feeling the wind of its passage ruffle his hair. But the third was coming straight for his heart, and Jon knew he couldn't avoid it. That was when Daario Naadh's appeared like an avenging spirit, his curved sword taking the third attacker in the neck with a spray of crimson. The Tidriosi captain's ornate armor was dented and bloodied, but his gold tooth still gleamed as he grinned at Jon. "Careful, your grace," Daario said, using the title that Jon's followers had begun to employ despite his protests. "Dead kings make poor employers." Jon dispatched his remaining opponent with a quick thrust to the chest, and nodded his thanks to the sellsword captain. "I owe you a debt. Just promise me a good story to tell in the taverns," Daario replied, already turning to face new enemies. The tide of battle finally turned, when Balerion landed directly on top of the largest surviving elephant, his massive claws tearing through the wooden tower as if it were made of parchment. The great beast collapsed under the dragon's weight, its death cry echoing across the battlefield like a funeral dirge. The sight of their most powerful weapon being literally crushed by a dragon broke the last of the Golden Company's resolve. What had been an orderly retreat became a rout. Golden Company soldiers threw down their weapons and fled in all directions, their famous discipline finally cracking under the pressure of dragonfire and death. Captain General Toyne tried to rally them one last time, but an arrow from a Dothraki bow took him in the throat, and his death marked the end of organized resistance. Jon stood among the carnage, his sword dripping with blood and his armor scorched by flames. The battlefield was a scene from the Seven Hells. Burned elephants lay like small mountains among the corpses of men and horses, while smoke rose from a dozen different fires. The acrid smell of burned flesh and melted metal filled the air, making it hard to breathe. "Victory," Thoros said simply, approaching Jon through the smoke and ash. "But at what cost?" The priest's words proved prophetic as the casualty reports began to arrive. Jon's forces had won a decisive victory, breaking the Golden Company's power and scattering their remnants to the winds. But the cost had been severe. Nearly 3,000 of his own men lay dead or dying, and twice that number bore wounds that would mark them for life. Among the fallen was Khal, the Dothraki chieftain who had served Jon faithfully for 2 years. The Khal had died as he had lived, charging directly into the elephant line with his eric raised high. His Khaleesi would sing songs of his bravery around their fires for generations to come. But that was small comfort to Jon as he looked down at the warrior's still form. He died well, Jacket said, his own face bearing fresh scars from the battle. The great stallion will welcome him with honor. Jon nodded, but the words felt hollow. Every victory in this war had cost him good men, and he was beginning to wonder if the price was becoming too high to pay. How many more would die before the free cities finally accepted that their old ways were ending? The answer came sooner than expected. As Jon's forces tended to their wounded and gathered their dead, riders approached under a flag of parley. They bore the banners of Braavos, Lys, Myr, and Tyrosh, the 4 cities that had funded the Golden Company's campaign. Their message was simple. They wished to discuss terms. Tormund laughed, his wild beard still singed from dragonfire. After they hired sellswords to kill us all, I say we burn their cities and be done with it. That would make us no better than the masters we've been fighting, Jon replied, though part of him was tempted by the wildling's suggestion. We'll hear what they have to say. The negotiations that followed were tense and complex, conducted in a pavilion erected on the battlefield while the dead were still being counted. The representatives of the free cities were clearly shaken by the destruction they had witnessed, their eyes constantly darting to where Balerion and Ygritte perched nearby like living reminders of Jon's power. The terms they offered were generous: recognition of Jon's conquests, massive reparations for the cost of the war, and guarantees of non-interference in his territories. In exchange, they asked only that he spare their cities and allow their trade to resume unmolested. And what of the slaves? Jon asked, his gray eyes hard as winter steel. Your cities still profit from human misery. The lead negotiator, a nervous Braavosi banker named Tycho Nestoris, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. That is a complex matter, Your Grace. The slave trade has been the foundation of our economies for centuries. To simply abandon it would mean treating human beings as human beings instead of property, Jon interrupted. The choice is yours. End the slave trade voluntarily, or I'll end it for you. The threat was not idle, and everyone in the pavilion knew it. Jon's dragons circled overhead as if to emphasize the point, their shadows passing over the negotiating table like omens of destruction. After hours of heated discussion, the free cities agreed to a gradual abolition of slavery over a period of 5 years, with Jon's forces monitoring compliance. It was not everything Jon had hoped for, but it was a beginning. The war that had begun with his liberation of a single slave ship had grown into something that would reshape the entire continent. The old order was dying, and from its ashes would rise something new, something better, if Jon could find the strength to see it through. As the sun set over the battlefield, Jon stood alone among the dead, his dragons perched nearby like silent guardians. The victory was his, but the cost weighed heavily on his conscience. 3,000 of his followers would never see another sunrise, their lives spent to purchase freedom for millions of slaves across Essos. Was it worth it? He asked the gathering darkness, but the only answer was the wind whistling through the bones of fallen elephants. Daario approached, his usual swagger subdued by the day's events. The men are asking what comes next, he said quietly. The free cities are broken, the Golden Company is scattered. Some think we should sail for Westeros while our dragons are still young and strong. Jon considered the suggestion, remembering the offer from House Folieron that still awaited his answer. The Iron Throne seemed within reach now, his dragons grown large enough to challenge any army that might stand against him. But the memory of the day's carnage gave him pause. Not yet, he said, finally. We have work to finish here first. The slaves we've freed need time to build new lives, and our enemies need time to accept that the old ways are truly dead. When we sail for Westeros, it will be as liberators, not conquerors. Daario nodded, though Jon could see the disappointment in his eyes. The sellsword captain was a man of action, more comfortable with sword and fire than with the slow work of building a better world. But he was loyal, and that loyalty would have to be enough. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Jon made his way back to his tent, leaving the battlefield to the dead and the carrion birds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new choices, but tonight he would mourn the fallen and try to find some measure of peace in the knowledge that their sacrifice had not been in vain. The war elephants lay silent in the gathering darkness, their bronze-sheathed tusks gleaming like fallen stars. They had been magnificent creatures, bred for war and trained to kill, but they had been no match for dragonfire and the determination of free men fighting for their liberty. Like the old order they had served, they were now nothing more than memories and ash. But from that ash, something new was growing. Jon could feel it in the wind that carried the smoke of battle across the plains, could see it in the eyes of the former slaves who now stood as free men and women. The world was changing. One battle at a time, and though the cost was high, the prize was worth any sacrifice. The elephants had burned, but from their flames, freedom was rising.